Solutions to the Dropout Crisis. Addressing the dropout crisis one strategy at a time. Brought to you by the National Dropout Prevention Center with support from Penn Foster and Catapult Learning and in partnership with Clemson Broadcast Productions. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the September issue of Solutions. This is Marty Duckenfield, and I'm so happy to see you. I pretend that I see you here today, but I'm really happy to see John Gaylor here today, who's my co-host from the National Dropout Prevention Center. Hi, John.
Hi, Marty. It's good to be with you today.
It's kind of neat. School has started for everybody. Here we are. Hope it's all going well. Some of you start in August, but a lot wait till after Labor Day, so Here we are. It might be the first day of school for some people.
That's right. Yeah. We hope we have start the school year off with some good professional development and give some valuable tools to teachers as they get ready to start.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And we're going to talk about today's program in just a minute. But first, we always kind of do a recap of what's going on. I don't know if it's a recap or a pre-cap of what's going on with professional development at the National Dropout Prevention Center, and who better to talk about it than John Gaylor, who watches over all that. So, John, what's coming up?
Well, we have some exciting things happening. We've got 3 events, really, that I want to mention. One of them is a new event. The first one is taking place later this month. It is taking place September 20th through the 23rd. It is a Diploma Planning Institute in Biloxi, Mississippi. And that is an opportunity for school administrators to come together and to build a plan for dropout prevention for their schools. We're finding that a lot of states are now legislating and mandating that schools have dropout prevention plans, and they have committees that don't know where to get started or how to put together a good plan that makes sense for their context. So that's September 20th through the 23rd in Biloxi, Mississippi. Then we have our national conference, which will be taking place October 25th through the 28th in San Antonio. We are especially excited about this conference because we have a large focus that will be there for rural dropout prevention. We have a focus that will also be on Hispanic population, and then also another one on putting together a dropout prevention plan for your school. So it's going to be an exciting conference with anywhere about 100 breakout sessions and some fabulous keynote speakers. Then June 26th through the 29th, of particular interest to today's topic for this show, we have a new event that's taking place, and it will be in Kissimmee, Florida, June 26th through the 29th. It is the Reaching the Wounded Student Conference, a trauma-informed approach to K-12 education. We're excited about that one. Anybody that watches this show today and is interested in this topic, that is an event they want to be at.
Well, I think so, and I hope that we do a reminder about that at the end of the show, John, because some people do sign in a little early, and that's one they need to know about after watching the program today.
Yes, and our guest today has been very instrumental in shaping that conference and helping us put that together, so we will definitely be mentioning that.
Very good. Okay. Well, we are talking about the wounded student today with a guest. You know, I always like having people in the studio. I say that every time. But there's something kind of exciting about going to Ohio virtually and seeing our guest in the studio with us. Is what we get to do today. So you're going to get to meet him as we are meeting him in the digital power. But before we get started and John introduces Joe, I want to point out to everybody, for good professional development, the center has always been adamant about this. We have this showcase of an hour program to give you a presenter, a national figure on a particular topic of great importance at dropout prevention. But we don't stop there. And this is the key point I need to make, that on this website are resources, websites, and follow-ups so you can work with your staff and do the kind of professional development that makes for change. So please look at the resources afterwards, and you can join a national discussion. We have the discussion board that you see on the webpage. But also, the center has this tweet situation going on. John, you might understand better than me. But we have this at NDPCN discussion. And if you do a hashtag under that, Hope for the Wounded, and we're putting all these up on the screen for you to jot down, and they will also be on the website in case you don't get it jotted down now. But if you look at hashtag Hope for the Wounded, then that'll zero in on the conversation that might be generated by today. I think there'd be a lot of interesting things that people will want to share about this whole topic today. And there's a different venue and of course, Joe will be providing his email address so you can directly write him afterwards as well. So we have the hashtag Twitter thingy, and we have the discussion board, and we have our wonderful guest who is also very willing to kind of follow up with you. So please engage in the conversation after this. I think you'll have lots of things. Jot your notes down during the program and get involved in that kind of way. So I think we've covered all the basics, and now we're ready to have all of you meet the gentleman that we're meeting. And on a monitor here right now is Joe Hendershot. So, John Gaylor, you got the honors today to introduce our fine guest.
All right. Well, it is an honor to introduce Dr. Joe Hendershot. Joe has become a good friend of the center. He presents and speaks at a lot of our conferences. We do consult him. It's always good to talk with him and spend time with him. He has just a wealth of experience. He has been a teacher at a juvenile correction center. He has been an alternative school principal. He's been a high school principal. He has been a principal of a boys' village, which was a residential care facility. He is currently the executive director for field experiences and internships at Ashland University in Ohio. He and his wife have 9 children, 4 of which they have adopted through out of foster care, through private adoption services, and also through international adoption services. So this is a gentleman that is a joy to know, and he lives what he is about to share with us. Yes. So we're excited to have Joe with us. Joe, welcome to our program.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Marty. I appreciate that.
Well, maybe you could get us started on what we're going to learn today. Here we are. I think John's got the PowerPoint set up and the title page there, so let's get started.
Joe, why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and about Hope. I did not mention you are the director of Hope for the Wounded, which is an organization that does educational seminars and things across the country. Why don't you share with us a little bit about that?
Okay. I had an opportunity when I was teaching to work. You heard my background already, working in juvenile corrections, working in alternative schools, to work with what we would normally call at-risk children. One of the things that I really became aware of was that we had some children beyond at risk. And so that's what we're going to talk about here today. So we started an organization called Hope for the Wounded to take training out to educators, like many of you watching this program today. We want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of today's educators, teachers, administrators, school board members that understand the population of students beyond at risk. I am not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, I'm not a counselor. I was a principal and a teacher, much like many of you, and I just knew that I needed deeper skills, deeper training to meet the needs of our students' social emotional needs, and then how that would benefit their academic progress. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how we're going to tie in and take a look at the social emotional aspect of trauma, woundedness, if you would, and explain the difference between at-risk and wounded. So that's kind of where we're at, and I've been going around the country since I think around 2006, and had the privilege and the honor of working with many excellent professionals.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting distinction to make, and we must, of course, right from the start. We talk about young people coming from at-risk situations where there's a potential of something going wrong. But I think you're going to share with us now that there is a definite difference and an important distinction between that term at-risk and wounded.
Yeah, right, Marty. In 2008, the National Traumatic Stress Network said that 25% of our students attending our schools today have dealt with some type of childhood trauma that affects learning and behavior. So, you can do the math in your own school, the large number of students that are walking around dealing with some form of trauma. And so you heard, again, my background. And when I was working at the alternative school and when I was working at juvenile corrections, treatment centers, I would get a lot of at-risk training. And a lot of at-risk training is very, very good stuff. And it works wonderfully with students that are truly at risk. And those are preventative measures, I believe, to try to help kids from going down a different road or help them from becoming wounded. So we definitely believe in the at-risk training, and we definitely believe that we have at-risk children. But where we're going to go with this is, what do we do with the students that are beyond at risk? And that's what today is about. So that's kind of where I started. I can give a couple stories on how I kind of formulated that. One time I was really struggling. I went to a lot of at-risk conferences, and I would come back and I just wasn't meeting the needs of my students. So I started attending counseling conferences. You heard, as a foster adoptive parent, I started getting some training and realizing that we do have children with deeper needs. I also had a son who was severely hurt one time, and because of the training of an excellent police officer that had a deeper training, I was able to help my son, and it all turned out fine. And so I thought, you know what, that's probably what today's educators need. I know that's what I needed. And so I've asked that question around the country. How many teachers, how many administrators feel they have the basic level knowledge to meet the needs of the children that is coming into their classrooms and schools today? And I get very few hands up to say they feel that way. And again, I'm not a counselor, social worker, none of those things, but I'm an educator that wanted to look at a deeper level of the social emotional aspect that our students are coming and needing, and to meet their academic needs. So I went in to my first school after kind of talking about this, and I talked to my staff one day. I said, how do you feel about, we have kids beyond at risk? I was working at an alternative school at the time. And, I really didn't have all my studies down, and it was just kind of a thought process. And I had one of my staff members that was a retired military person. And he said, Joe, I like the term. He says, because, you see, I get to be a good soldier again. I get to be a good warrior again. And he said, because a good soldier and a good warrior never leaves anyone in the battlefield wounded. And then he said to me, I'm going to teach you something you don't know also. And that is, we may go out to get them, and they may say, just leave us here. But a good warrior and a good soldier will pick up that child and bring them back. So he said, I think what you're asking us to do is to stop losing our kids, maybe being quick to suspend them, expel them, look at alternative solutions, and go get the ones that we've already lost. So from there, it kind of spearheaded into a lot of different, I've really worked with some great educators that help formulate this, and put it into practice. And we saw lives changed. And that's the important thing. We want to see young students' lives change that needs that extra help.
That's a great comparison, I think. Stories really do tell the real core of what you're talking about and make it real. Thank you for sharing that story. And I find it also interesting that it was stemmed from your own personal experience too. That does happen out there. We need to learn from those experiences.
It does. Yeah. And Joe, you've referred to the at-risk young people, and you've referred to wounded young people. Let's go ahead and jump into some of your subject matter and discuss maybe the difference between the two, and then go ahead and start with, what does a wounded student look like? Okay.
Well, the first thing that I think is critical when we look at dealing with wounded students is, and we all have vision and mission statements in our school, and we want to keep those. But if we do believe, if the people watching this program believe that they have students beyond at risk, I think it's good to take a look and have a discussion at the beginning of the school year, which it is right now, to have that beginning discussion now before we get into a lot of emotional issues, till we get into a lot of areas, and we're trying to figure it out while we're in the middle of it. And I think a vision and a mission statement needs to take place if we believe we have wounded children. So we developed just kind of an example, my wife, myself, and our children, when we started this organization. And we said, we believe that all children are valuable and can achieve their full potential when they are esteemed and empowered by hope. And really, this is all about hope. And there's many definitions of hope. But I think when I talk with people all around the country, I think that's the thing they say with their children, the children that are wounded. It's like they lack that hope. They've kind of quit dreaming. And it's our job to turn that dream back on for them and provide and instill hope into their young lives. And the vision is anything you want it to be. It can be as big as you want it to be. Now, the good news is we're at an all-time high in graduation. We 40-year all-time high. We're doing good work, but we're still losing about 20% of our kids. So we want to talk about that today. Our mission is we desire to equip and empower and encourage those educators to discover and cultivate the unique abilities and the gifts that all children possess. And we know that all educators are out there trying to cultivate the unique abilities that all their students possess. We know that when our educators go to work every day, they're trying to find the gift that each child brings into their school. And sometimes some of those social emotional issues get in the way of that, and we're going to talk about maybe how we can identify some of those things.
Okay, so can you give us some of the signs of a wounded student, and let's start there, and begin that discussion.
Well, some of the signs of a wounded student. The biggest thing when I go out and talk, I ask people, what does a wounded student look like? And if you think about that, it can really look like any of us. It can really look like anybody. And so that's, I think, the biggest thing is to say, okay, so now that it's hard to identify, maybe what are some of the behaviors or what are some of the situations that can cause students to be wounded? And examples of wounds can be abuse, neglect, poverty, violence, absence of parents, self-esteem issues, anger, and depression. And now I just want to say, when I talk about these can be indicators of woundedness, but they don't necessarily guarantee woundedness. So just because a child is in poverty does not guarantee that they're wounded. Just because a child maybe comes from a single-parent home does not guarantee that the child is wounded. I've seen some of the greatest kids come out of single-parent homes. I've seen some of the greatest kids come out of poverty. But they can be indicators that we want to definitely pay attention to. My 4 adoptive children, I talk about why wounded. We got a call about 8 years, almost to the date, for a foster daughter who was born 5 weeks premature and was a little over 4 pounds, and was asked to come live with us. She's now our daughter, but at the time that spoke to me, because my daughter taught me this, that some kids do come into the world wounded. And I thought that was a very powerful lesson that she taught me. So dealing with this subject matter, I really learned that I had to dig deeper and not really judge the behaviors, not really judge why students are wounded, but figure out how to deal with it once it's identified.
Okay. How do you identify those students? If you're looking at what are the signs that you might see?
The signs, you can certainly see anger, frustration, students that isolate themselves. Some people break it down as a class clown. We could see bullying. We could see kids that accept being bullied, which isn't okay. So there's a variety of indicators of students, that are wounded. A lot of anger issues, depression, things like that.
Okay. And the causes of those, I've heard you talk about putting some of those causes into different categories. In moving through your material, how would you classify some of those wounds?
Well, I had the privilege to work with a Dr. Terry Wardle at Ashland University, who has wrote several books on the topic. And he talked about, and he shared with me, and I want to share with you today, some of the typologies of wounds that students are dealing with. This is in his book, Strong Winds and Crashing Waves. But the 5 typologies of wounds that Dr. Wardle talks about is our students have traumatic wounds of withholding from their childhood. So do you have students, to the audience out there, do you have students in your school who have traumatic wounds of withholding? And what is a traumatic wound of withholding? A traumatic wound of withholding could be, now normally I would ask for feedback at this point, and we would walk through those, but I'll just give you what a traumatic wound of withholding may look like. Could be love. So you might have a student that really hovers around you and follows you. Could be basic core needs. It could be shelter. It could be safety. It could be food, hunger. Those could be wounds of withholding that a child receives. Now, I talk about 2 of those that I have to deal with every day with my own children. And you heard the background of my children. But my one son came from another country, and when we brought our son home, our son could not walk. And our son, we took him to the doctor, and our son, after they took x-rays, found out he had multiple stress fractures throughout his entire body due to a lack of nutrition. And so we asked the doctor, what's the cure? What's the cure? And he said, just vitamins and minerals that we're going to find in food. And so we started, obviously, a healthy diet for him. And I'm proud to say today, there's kind of a great story behind him and how far he's come. He actually runs races and does very well, and he likes to go out, and he's just healed physically very, very nicely from those wounds. But I ask people, his behavior in school may be a little different in a cafeteria, maybe a little different around food, around snacks, because he's still working on overcoming some of those. And again, the good news, trauma can be overcome with the interventions and the special help. And he's moving towards that healing. Again, there's the physical and there's the social emotional needs that go along with that. And we had another daughter that came out of an orphanage as well. So we have typologies of wounds of withholding. The second one is traumatic wounds of aggression in childhood. And those are ones that we're usually mandated reporters. We get, aggressive things. We understand students have been abused. Well, there's also traumatic wounds caused by stressful events. And we have kids in our school today that are cruising through, doing a really nice job and achieving and just have their social emotional needs being met, and things are going fine, and then a stressful event will occur in their life, and then they become wounded, and then we see some different behaviors. We then have traumatic wounds caused by betrayal. And I tell people that when I was a principal, I always told my mom I was going to grow up and be a teacher and a principal. And a lot of the kids that I worked with had felt, right or wrong, they felt betrayed by authority in the past, either a family member or, and in some instances, they know that is indeed wrong, but the wounds of betrayal. So they saw me as an authority figure, so they definitely, it was harder to build a relationship. Sometimes it took me 2 or 3 years to build a relationship from a student that thought they were betrayed. We also have traumatic wounds caused by long-term duress. We had students who came to school, and every night they'd go home and they would be under a constant duress. And Terry said even a marble slab that hit by a drop of water will eventually begin to wear. So those are the typologies. If you're looking at ways to identify those may not be clinical in nature, but those are some ways that we could address those. If we look then at the cause and effects of wounds, we would say wounds cause false beliefs. And do you have kids in your school walking around with false beliefs? And what are false beliefs? The students might say, the teacher doesn't like me, the principal doesn't like me, my classmates don't like me. And then because they're wounded and because they have this false belief, some of them may even go global with their comments and say, nobody likes me. Everybody hates me, And so those, and that's just not true. And if students have false beliefs, it starts to lead to emotional upheaval and dysfunctional behavior. So I tell teachers and educators across the country, we have, if we have 25%, maybe more in your school, maybe less in your school, but if we have wounded kids, we know they're going to walk in with false beliefs and wounds, and that'll lead to those dysfunctional behaviors. So to try to undo the dysfunctional behaviors and the emotional upheaval, we want to try to attack their false beliefs and let them see that they are valued, they are loved, they are cared for, they can achieve, they can do math, they can do art, they can be involved in music. And if we don't address those, it turn into life situations. So that's kind of the typologies and the cause and effects of wounds that I would like to talk about.
Well, I find this really interesting because that first example you gave was one dear to my heart because I have a nutrition background. But it's a very simple scientific way. When we have a problem, we have a scientific solution to malnourishment is provide the food, the vitamins and minerals and so forth. But by the same token, you're saying that if we identify the cause as one of betrayal and not trusting and so forth, we know what that is. There are actual tools we can use to heal that as well as you did with your son and the nutritional losses that he had. That's kind of a great comparison, I think, that people need to make that jump from diagnosis of something to a proper treatment. And I think that's where you're taking us today. Would that be a right way to compare it?
Yeah, Marty. I think the one thing that I talk about is I have 3 parts to my training, and it's this: understanding, reaching, transforming. Mm-hmm. Because I believe for you to reach anybody, you first must understand them.
Yes.
And then to transform anybody, you must be able to reach them. So in the case, of a child that's been wounded, we have to get the understanding piece. And like you said, there's some immediate things we could do maybe to help a student heal physically, but sometimes these wounds take a great deal of time because you have to go through those steps of understanding, reaching, and transforming. So there is a time factor involved.
So I think, Joe, one of the things I'm hearing you say when you recognize that is a situation with a number of young people in our schools, our approach to dealing with students what I'm hearing, can hurt them or can move them toward healing. Is that correct? And if that's correct, what would then be some ways really to address those wounded students, or some ways to address students that would move them toward a feeling of acceptance and toward eventually healing?
Yeah, well, I think it's really not about trying to control a student or trying to fix them. It is really, the word you use is trying to heal them. And some of the things that we can do in our school. Now, I can just say what was true of me. It may not be true of anybody watching this program, but there were times, and I'm not happy to say that, but there were times when I didn't understand this, that I might maybe suspend a student who had a dysfunctional behavior or an emotional upheaval because I didn't understand they were coming out of false belief and wounds. I just saw them breaking a policy. I saw them not following a handbook. So I really had to say, okay, if I really understand and I'm going to reach them, what are some ways in which I can do that? So we developed alternative discipline models, self-esteem. An important part of this whole process is the counseling piece in your schools, because the important part of this is to always know your limitations as a caregiver. I don't want anybody to think that they're to counsel kids out of their wounds. Okay, but sometimes we're the primary caregiver, and having that understanding piece was really a deep way in which I could start that, help that student get started towards that as we were getting them to the counseling, to the professional help that they needed. but always know your limitations. But we had counseling, we had alternative schools, and I'm a big proponent of alternative schools, the proper structure of developing alternative schools, and the sense of community that they must remain in if they're in an alternative school, and maybe how alternative schools can be a placeholder for them to work on their woundedness, and then filter or their way back into the regular school setting, back into community. So we had talked about alternative schools. We could develop an individual, no failure attitude. I had a teacher one time that just told students that she believed deeply that they weren't failures, that they were getting failing grades because they weren't completing their work. So really they were incompleters and not failures. So just the way she approached her students was she got them to think, you know what, I'm not a failure. But if I do my work, she said, if you do your work, I believe you're all smart enough to pass. She developed that way to reach them, to understand them and reach them. And she did that for several years. And she just had great success. And so you can do it on a global scale in your entire school, or you can do it in your own individual classroom. And I always talk about extending grace and mercy, which is just, on Webster's online, it talks about being a temporary exemption and a compassionate treatment. So, I like to say when I'm dealing with wounded kids, I know with some of the background where I've worked, my family used to ask me, how I could work in those situations with students that I wasn't used to working with. And I'd say, the easiest way for me was to understand this. What was true of them was true of me, and what was true of me is true of them. So really it goes back to some of those basic principles, the core longings that we all have to be accepted, to be loved, to be nurtured. And so those are some ways in which we can do it. But I think counseling is a big component within this too. So we'll go from there.
All right, and tell us a little bit, you talk about teachable moments, and that really is taking an approach to the things that happen and the things that we encounter, behavior, everything that we see. Tell us a little bit about the teachable moments when it comes to taking advantage of opportunities with wounded students.
Right. Well, one of the things that I was able to work with my staff was to really value the opportunities we had for teachable moments. And it goes back to that saying of every behavior is a teachable moment. And then I had to go back and examine and reflect on my own career and say, did I ever pass up a teachable moment? And what kind of a message does that send to a wounded child? So for me, I'm going to say, yes, I did. And again, I'm not proud of that. But I started opening up and saying, I need to take opportunities for those teachable moments. And I was able to instill into the staff was able to instill into each other that if a student has emotional upheaval, if we were all experts in working with wounded children. And I think that's a key component, because if you pass up a teachable moment, it feeds into a wounded child's already false belief system that somebody doesn't get me, somebody doesn't understand me, they're going to send me to somewhere else. And so we don't want to feed that false belief system. We want to say, hey, we're willing to crawl in the ditch with you. Hey, we're willing to work with you. We do understand you. We do get you. And I just think, for us, it's the ability to invest in their lives by the gift of time. And you've heard me reference Dr. Wardle before, and I know Dr. Wardle said one time, it's better to be unavailable than inattentive. And so if we're really attentive to our students' needs, we're going to take opportunities and be excited for those teachable moments, because all behavior has meaning. So we have to, I say this when I go out, and we have to teach our students, or help them understand, teach them out of their trauma, not consequence them out of their trauma. So use those teachable moments.
Yeah, I think those are key moments in an education life that often get overlooked, and to be kind of just cognizant of those opportunities and And they are gifts to have that opportunity to give a child a real living example of you're in this moment right now, and you as the teacher can be perceptive enough to see that and not go the consequence route, but the education route. And we've talked about that here, this program before, and I think that this program reinforces a lot of that kind of discussion.
And Joe, while every behavior is a teachable moment, some behaviors carry more serious consequences than others, or more serious ramifications for those people that are present or in the context of that behavior. Are there those situations where we're talking about very serious behavior? How do you deal with that? It's to say giving mercy and grace is good, but there are some that demand some hard action. I think some, when you're dealing with drug or violence issues, there needs to be a warning with this kind of approach to young people. Is that true?
Yeah, John, it's absolutely true, and I want to make sure that it is clear that there are non-negotiables. And I had to expel students from my schools for the non-negotiables. As you mentioned, there's drugs, there's weapons, there's violent acts, and those can't be tolerated. But the question really becomes this: can you still take the philosophy of what we're talking about and take it into the darkest place of a child's life? So if a child commits a non-negotiable and they have to be expelled, justice can still prevail. The handbook can still be applied. The consequence can still be given. The expulsion could still be given. And we were able to do that. And then, so one time I asked one of my superintendents, I said, after this expulsion hearing, because we had a student that committed a non-negotiable, and the student had to go to juvenile court, the student had to go to the expulsion hearing. Nothing was swept under the rug at all. But I asked the superintendent, I said, can I have the last word after we do the business that we have to do here today? And she said, sure. So in that expulsion hearing, I wanted to leave that family, I wanted to leave that child with a redeeming quality. So I was able to say, yes, you did wrong. Yes, there's consequences. Yes, there's justice. Yes, you need, we're providing some counseling for you to get in this area that we're not experts in, but please take advantage of that counseling. But what I was able to say as a principal, as a teachable moment, as an educator to that child was this: I had to pour some kind of positive word into his wound. And I simply said to him, through this whole process, you were honest with me. And you've got to pay some consequences for these decisions, but we're going to build on that strength that you had of honesty. And I thank Mom and Dad for teaching them that honesty piece. And it really turned out, because when I would go back from expulsion hearings, I think some people would see me as a great leader, maybe because I upheld the handbook or I upheld the rules, and that was my job, and I believed in doing that. But I also knew even if a child got the maximum expulsion, they were still returning to our school, and they needed to have something to hang their hat on, some type of redeeming quality for them to come back and achieve. And I found many of the students, when I just left them something, even in the non-negotiables, they came back a stronger student.
Oh, I think that's a powerful example of this whole thing, to go in and build on the strengths and find the redeeming qualities there, because they are there. And that's an excellent example, Joe. Thank you for that. All right, and so we're going to keep moving on to find out how we can all continue this, how to address these students. And we have some specifics here, I think, John, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's. And one of my favorites is coming up is school climate. Can you start talking about that particular list of ways to address these students, Joe?
Yeah, some of the ways that we were able to, and again, when I say we, I really mean we. We had a lot of school climate committees, school discipline committee meetings to talk about these issues. And I think the biggest way to address a wounded student was this, and I probably can't stress this enough, is to start where the student's at. To say where you're at today is enough to be accepted in this school. Showing up is enough. As Dr. Wardle had taught me one time, sometimes it's just a matter of showing up. And so I think that's just that basic need to be invited into community. We'll get to performance and stuff later. Communicate your expectations. Be willing, again, to crawl into the ditch with a student. I always tell people, and they say, well, should I do that? Shouldn't I do that? What do you mean by that? I like comparisons, and I like to say, again, what's true of them is true of me. And I say this: were there times in my life where I had to have someone crawl in the ditch with me to help me out? And so I would answer that, yes. There were times in my life where I needed someone to help me out. And those people became my best friends because I could trust them to be there in the hard times. So just having that kind of mentality that says, not only the kids coming in with the dysfunctional behaviors and their woundedness, but we're willing to crawl in the ditch with them and help them through that. I think that's a very important way. I think there's some academic ways. I think our arts, our music, some of the things that we normally do away with are great ways for students to express themselves through their wounds. So I know when I worked in some of the treatment centers that you had music therapy and art therapy, and we had some real programming that helped students through some of their traumas. So again, there's a lot of different ways in which we can help wounded students.
And then I see that last one on there. It says display empathy. So let's talk a little bit about empathy.
Well, empathy. I did my research study on emotional literacy and focused a lot on empathy, and I talk about it in my second book. But empathy, again, is the ability to not just step in someone else's shoes, but the ability to step in someone else's shoes and feel what they're feeling. So it's that extra step to really help our students know that we're being empathic with them. Mary Gordon wrote a book called Roots of Empathy. And in her book, I've not met Mary Gordon, I haven't heard her speak, but she has a brilliant book. And she talks about, in her school, providing opportunities for her students to give and receive empathy. So I think that's really important. I can't say enough about, when I look at how to get people ways to do it, and if we want to not use the word empathy, maybe we can just say the ability to attune with our students. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can do that. And the question becomes, when we're dealing with wounded children, do we really know what it's like? Yeah. If I go back to my son, do I really know what it's like to be a point of where my body may be struggling because of a lack of nutrition? So, but we may not be able to be empathic to that level, but we can be compassionate, and maybe we understand it through a different wound, and we can be empathetic through that way.
Yeah, that's a challenging one for sure.
The other thing, if I could I want to kind of close with this. I think our students today, when we're talking about empathy, are speaking to us. Mm-hmm. Because they'll make a comment and they'll say this: do you feel me? Do you feel what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's kind of something we pass off as, oh, this is something kids say. But in reality, what they're saying to us is this: I need you to be able to connect with me on a feeling or an emotional level if you're going to reach me. They're asking for us to attune to what they're saying, to be empathic.
All right, Joe, let's turn more towards some very specific things that school systems or schools or administrators can do to reach or to provide what is needed for those wounded students. Can you go ahead and get into some of those things? We've got just a little bit of time left, and we want to get into some things. You've got some guidelines, I think, and suggestions for alternative schools, things of that nature. Can you share those with us?
Again, we've talked already about developing alternative schools, a no-failure policy. We talked about some of those things, but let's go specifically to alternative discipline. We want to we want to find redeeming qualities in our students. We want to position from of teaching and not punishing. So we were taking all these things at the school and we were saying, okay, what were we doing wrong and what do we want to do right based on what we've talked about here today? And so I met with some teachers and we said, what can we do? And we took the concept of community. We took the concept of teachable moments. We took the concept of being empathic. We took the concept of grace and mercy. And we said, let's develop a program. And so what we knew is we had a high dropout rate that we wanted to fix. We had a high expulsion rate we wanted to fix, a high suspension rate we wanted to fix, and we wanted higher achievement and higher attendance. So what we did was we developed a community service program. And we said, okay, if a kid has to come in and they've been suspended, we would trade off that suspension for maybe 2 or 3 nights of community service with the idea that they would be in school. Now, we're not talking about students that have done non-negotiables, drugs and weapons. We're talking about general behaviors that kids would normally get suspended for. And we developed community service where students would work at the local animal shelter. If you wanted to go outside the school, you could do some things like that. They could volunteer at a special needs school in town. And our teachers would work with them for those 2 hours after school in the community service. And we use those as teachable moments to talk about their behavior, to talk about changing. And here's the thing, it empowered them to be a part of community and to give back. But it also kept them in school, so they got a consequence. They still had something, but we didn't want it to be a detention where they just sat there or just put their head down or just served time. We wanted it to be a meaningful consequence. So again, we ran this in about 3 different schools that I was at, and really we turned it into a lot of community service projects. We would do newspaper articles about our students who were doing great community service work. And that was much better than them being suspended, because what we found out when we were suspending kids, they weren't in school. A lot of the parents were working. They were ending up in the newspaper in a different way. And we wanted to control how our students were ending up in the newspaper. And what ended up happening was the superintendent went from about 20 angry parent phone calls on discipline to 0. Because what parent is going to be upset because you're teaching their child community? You want to keep them in school. And we would do that, and you'd have 2 or 3 chances to do that before to go back into a suspension round. And it was really, we found it effective. We called it a community service program.
Well, what I find interesting about these kinds of programs that employ service is the transformation that takes place with students, and also perhaps their desire after the community service to continue to do activities like that. So in your experience, what have you seen and can share with us about, number one, transformation, and also their interest in continuing to get back to the community and do those types of activities?
Well, that's a great point, Marty. And as we talked about, we're talking about understanding, reaching, and transforming. And we're definitely in the transforming phase when we're in a program like this. And what we saw was students that said this, when they worked with maybe animals at an animal shelter, that maybe they didn't feel, they could feel empathy towards someone or something else. Okay. We also, the transformational piece was the pride. We used to have students waiting at the door for us in the morning to say, Mr. Hendershott, come quick. I want to show you what we did last night. We put a bulletin board together with their teacher, that's in the main hallway. And they, took them a couple hours to make it just so. And it gave them a great sense of pride. And when you do things for others, it really starts to heal some of those wounds. It really starts to transform their lives that again, if you're going back and you're attacking those false beliefs, that they can give something, they are worthwhile, they can achieve, they are part of community. And that program really hit the home run for a lot of the students.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested. This is my service learning background here coming up, in the fact that this has been so successful after a problem arises. Have you thought about using it proactively in the alternative kind of principles that you're already engaging, which are so powerful anyway? I mean, when you go to the best alternative schools, you wish, in fact, the students there say, we wish our main school was like this one, and it sounds to me that's kind of the method you're approaching. But to have the service or community service or service learning be part of the natural way of doing things, do you think that would be, as we are in dropout prevention, a preventive kind of way for students to start to feel part of the community, to start to become leaders, and to do the transforming before these particular incidents take place?
Yeah, actually, Marty, we had students who, after they had done the program and served as a consequence, had asked if they could stay after school and still do some more community service because it made them feel good. And we allowed that. That was a great thing. And I will tell you, at some of the other places we work, we did institute some service learning that wasn't a consequence, where they had to work together to raise money maybe for cancer research or something else within maybe we had in one of the buildings, one of our students' fathers was diagnosed with cancer. So that became a project in which students raised money and were able to give back and do something about helping someone else. And when you're helping someone else, again, it really starts that transformational piece. So yes, that's a great point, and we have seen it work, and we have applied it as well in other areas of our schools.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. And Joe, we've got a little bit of time left, and I want to go to what you would list as key components of reaching the wounded student. If you could just go through the list that you've given us and just discuss that a little bit. And I know that some of this is mentioned in your books. I know Joe's books. He has 2 books that are out. One is Reaching the Wounded Student. The other title is, and Reaching the Wounded Student is available on our website. But your other book, 7 Ways to Transform Wounded Students? Is that the title?
7 Ways to Transform the Lives of Wounded Students.
Okay, and that book is in the process of being published now and will be available shortly. Is that right?
We're hoping by the beginning of 2016, and that's through Rutledge, Taylor and Francis Group.
Okay.
No, more resources. This is good.
Yes, and I know there is a lot more information in those books that will be helpful to anybody who is watching today. But just if you can, just in summary, those key components of reaching the wounded students, walk us through some of those. So you've mentioned some, but just elaborate on those for just a few minutes.
Obviously we want to work on building self-esteem, because when we talk about bullying issues and things like that, self-esteem issues are at the heart of a lot of bullying that takes place. So, again, do we provide opportunities for our students to receive and give empathy to one another? So, again, build self-esteem into your students. Understand and work with the student's emotional intelligence. Again, we're all emotional human beings. And it's important for us to understand. I mean, I know our job is to get kids to critically think and to come in and really sit down and provide. But a lot of the research that I've done has said this: if you pay attention to emotional literacy, almost every article that I've read said will positively impact academics.
Right.
Everybody I've heard speak, if you pay attention to this. So when people say to me, I have to keep focused on the academics, I say it's a direct correlation with academics, so it's critical.
That's and that's an important point, because someone in trying to reach students that are having behavioral issues or even academic, so many times what we find is administrators or teachers want to fall back on an academic solution, and the research really shows that there are the emotional connection and relational pieces that impact just as much of that. So that's an important point.
Right, definitely. The other part that we haven't really talked about much, briefly, about trying to keep kids in school and how parents appreciate that, is really, I'm trying to get schools to really, especially at the high school level, secondary level, to really involve parents. And I know that's kind of a cliche, that's kind of a given, but when working with wounded students, I think sometimes they don't always understand that their son or daughter may be with friends who are dealing with wounds. They may be in their home. They may be able to share. So when I go out and train staffs now, I ask them if they want to invite in one of their parent-teacher organizations. Last year I was at a high school down south, and they had me train the staff all day, and then they had a spaghetti dinner for the parents, and then I think we had over 200 parents that went into the auditorium just for an hour presentation about wounded students. That, these are some things, parents, that we're focusing on this year, and we just want to share that with you. And we think that's an important component. And a lot of the parents walked away and say, I know some of these kids that you're talking about, and they're able to communicate that with the school. And again, it's all about community concepts. And make all your rules achievable. And I think going back to the key part of everything I talk about is this. And a lot of people say to me, well, what's the home run here? And I think the home run is this, that, again, I said it earlier, showing up is enough. Showing up is enough for a student to warrant our attention. And they're bringing all their stuff in. And it's easy because we're very busy and we're very distracted with a lot of different things being thrown at us. But if we have these conversations beforehand and we all have that same philosophy, it really leads to some great things.
And it certainly seems like it's a school-wide effort, because it's hard for one classroom to do this when the external world that they engage in, right, the context, has to all be supportive. So this is, when you work with schools, you work with schools. And I think that's an important point to make, that the school, that environment, the climate needs to be supportive of this philosophy, which is going to find ways to reach all students, but particularly these wounded students who have the needs that are just so much greater than the others. This has been quite a revelation today, John. I'm so glad you invited Joe to join us. It's been incredible. We want to put up his contact information so everybody out there can write Joe, and you could get a lot of emails. So John, put it up on the screen for us, okay? And we can invite people to write Joe, but also, and there's his phone number, his website, his you got a lot up there. And so people can get in touch with Joe, but don't forget the discussion board and the tweet account. And what's the other thing you're supposed to remember to remind everybody about, John?
I am reminding them, this topic is really incredible. And we have been working with Joe to put together this conference in June. We are putting just some tremendous presenters that we have coming and speakers that are going to be coming. So that conference, again, is the Reaching the Wounded Student Conference, a trauma-sensitive approach to K-12 education. That's going to be June 26th to 29th. And I know all of our viewers are going to want to be a part of that. It is going to be a powerful conference that we are really looking forward to.
I mean, talk about going in depth. And I think also those of you who want to more soon, then that's next year, in October, they can go to San Antonio and meet Joe and talk about this in depth then as well. So I think there's some great opportunities ahead to follow up in person, and also these resources. Start, boning up on your materials and learning about it now. But I hope this has opened some doors for a lot of people out there. Joe, thank you so much for being with us virtually. It's been a pleasure to meet you and hear your stories and understand your message better.
Thank you, Marty and John. Thanks for having me here today. And I just want to thank you for the platform to bring this out to our educators. So hopefully they'll be able to reach more wounded students.
Exactly. Right. And this is our hope always, as we've discussed, is we want to reach as many people as we can with these important messages. And be sure you thank those folks there at Ashland University for allowing us to bring you here to join us and to also join everybody who's tuning in. So thanks to them as well. It's always good to have partners out there to make these things happen.
That's right. Thank you, Joe.
Well, John, golly, goodbye, Joe. And it's been great. And we have another show that just goes by in a blur so fast, but we learn a lot and we come out at the other end better for it, don't you think?
Good information, and really causes us to question our approach
Yeah.
to working with young people.
Yeah.
Valuable time.
Yeah, I loved having you join me today, John.
It's good to
see
be
you
here.
again. Good to see you. So thanks to all of you out there for joining us as well. September is going to be an interesting month for all of you as you get to know your students and where you're going for the year. And I hope this has been helpful in that regard. You can make some preliminary steps in working with your wounded students as well. So next month we'll be back here the second Tuesday in October. And I believe our guest is Amber Lang, who is going to talk about emerging scholars. And just all I'm going to say, because we'll have promo about it, but it's about introducing the whole idea of going to college and preparing young people from at-risk situations to see that they have opportunities in higher ed and how they can take advantage of them. So that'll be an interesting program next week, because we've got to look to the future now. It's not just the diploma anymore.
That's
It's
right.
beyond. So we're going to be talking about that. Thanks for joining us. This is Marty Duckenfield, and we'll see you next time.